Olof, thank you very much for joining on time, and introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I realize that I'm the last one out, so I will go through everything and save a bit of time at the end to have discussions and to ask questions on the material I will be talking about and what I will be talking about.
If you can share the screen to make sure it works smoothly.
Yes, now
Perfect.
I am sharing, I hope.
Yes.
Good. So my name is Olof Granberg. I work at the ICA Group here in the Nordics, I would say. ICA Group is based in Sweden, but we do have Rime as well in the Baltics. I have a background where I started out as a consultant and quite early started developing within analytics. And I am still at it. Haven't learned everything I want to learn, so I'm still working on that. And right now I'm heading up the data and analytics team at ICA Gruppen, and I am responsible for the IT side of our advanced analytics, machine learning, and data platforms, engineering, and strategy. And what I want to talk about today is one of the questions I ask myself over and over again is, how do I become a master of delivering fast and with good quality, and how do we do that as a team, as a company? And once you get past the first use cases, the first POCs, the kind of innovation lab, and you want to scale the delivery and you want to bring it really close to the business and have that kind of fast-paced delivery of business value. So once you go past having one team, you want to start scaling out your delivery, and you often do that by adding more teams, and you run these teams in parallel. The risk, though, of adding more and more teams is that you may create diverging solutions. And this has two or more drawbacks. The first is obviously the parallel work being done in each team when it comes to common functionality, such as reading files, handling data retention, deleting data, handling anonymizing customers, GDPR functionality, and so on. The second part is the long-term speed. As long as you keep working in diverging ways, you run, first of all, the risk of lower quality in the common components due to the fact that each of these teams build everything themselves. So if two teams spend 40 hours each on a XML file reader, you still have each of those components only have 40 hours in them. But if you kind of spend more time and reuse that between teams, then you can improve the quality. And as well, each team is only helped by themselves. And with that said, when you're running business value creation, you may not always have the time to take all of the practices that you want, and you may incur a lot of technical debt, and you may or may not manage that technical debt properly. And then you can take also take the other route of reducing delivery time. And you can for each use case, and you can streamline your processes. You can use various technologies and methodologies to reduce time to market for each particular use case. But if you reduce that time to delivery by cutting corners rather than creating reusability, you run the risk of adding a lot of technical and procedural debt. In the end, that will take up a lot of maintenance time, and maintenance time obviously takes time away from building new business value. So now we come to the topic that I want to talk about today, and that is frameworks. But first of all, what is a framework? So if we steal Collins Dictionary's definition of a framework as a framework is a particular set of rules, ideas, or beliefs which you use in order to deal with problems or to decide what to do. That is on the most abstract level. If we go into something that most of us are familiar with, a code framework is a digital representation of that definition in a reusable library of code with components that can be reused and extended. And having that type of internal open source library of code and components that is used, managed, and extended by all of the development teams, that leads to an overall shorter development time for each use case, while you can maintain a higher quality over time for the whole solution. And each of the teams can benefit from what the other teams are doing. But frameworks can also extend into everything we do when delivering a use case. So having common processes for things like data privacy approval, security audits, user management, and supporting templates for these processes can speed up the lead time for each of those, at least if you design them right. The important part around it is that they should be a help to the team rather than having strict controls and a lot of hoops to jump through when you deliver a use case. And then you come into the beliefs and ideas, and then you come into standards. Having common standards across the teams and across the organization ensure speed and agility over time. For example, if you work with data mesh, which is something that more and more companies are adopting today, and have data domain products, it's extremely important that these products follow a number of common standards. Standards such as addressability, so how do you address a certain data product, discoverability, on how do you find it, how do you find what it contains, and so on. Self-describing semantics and syntax, so how, without reading up on all of the documentation, how can I see what this contains, how to use it, and so on. And last but not least, interoperability. So how do I make the data products work together? How can they exchange data? How can we work with APIs and so on between them? Having those common standards means that the products can be lifecycled without creating that spider web of dependencies that we're all quite wary of. And then what are key characteristics of a good framework? So first of all frameworks should be helpful. They exist for the teams to deliver better and faster and with less frustration. So they're not meant to be a control on this is exactly the steps you need to take for each and every use case, and here are a lot of very mandatory things you need to do, and dotting all of the I's and crossing T's and so on. Secondly, a framework needs to be extensible. If you start off by creating the complete framework that will solve each and every use case, you will never be done. If you ever consider yourself to be done, the world will have moved on, so that framework is no longer relevant. The framework needs to be built iteratively. You need to work with MVPs in order to make sure that what you are delivering covers where you are today and the immediate future. A framework obviously needs to be reusable. The aim of the framework is to take a reusable component and, as a user, being able to instantiate and configure it for my specific use case. And that is very different from taking a copy-paste approach where I just take code and copy it between different use cases. Because if you work with the reusable components, then you will have better control around when you upgrade and change and extend the component. How do you then get that out to all of the use cases? And so basically it comes down to, do I change it in one place or in 150 places? Last but not least, a framework should be voluntary. If the framework does not support the specific use case in the best manner, then you complete the use case. You build it the way you want it to run, and then afterwards or while you're building that, you extend the framework with the new functionality or the new processes. In my opinion, common frameworks is the key for scaling out implementations. The goal of scaling out implementations is obviously to also scale out the business value that you want to create. But when you add a new team, there are so many different aspects to cover to introduce that team into becoming a productive team. You have everything from how do we build data pipelines to how do we monitor our data, how do we run our operations, and so on. Then we have the part around data product standards for creating new data products, managing them, and decommissioning data products. You also have really important processes like how do we manage data privacy and governance processes. If you don't manage them today, that is a huge risk factor for the company. So that is perhaps one of the few exceptions to the rule that framework should be mandatory. You need to manage a lot of the responsibilities. However, the framework should help you do that. And then having that common framework, if you create it in a good manner so that it's self-explanatory, so that it is well documented and it's easy to use, that assures that new teams can get up and running in a fast manner without the kind of extensive training and micromanagement and architectural boards and design boards that you may end up with. Around when you work with frameworks, there are obviously people you need in that. So who do you need? So you obviously need at least one owner. It needs someone that cares about that framework, wants to nurture it and make it grow. That doesn't mean that that person does all of the development or priorities what new features to be added and so on. But the owners will spend time and effort on identifying flaws, improvement areas, and can lift those up for prioritization. Obviously, you need contributors that as well should not be a single team, but rather you should work with in my opinion, at least in an open source kind of way where you can have a lot of contributors all over the organization. And they take pride in making good features so that they can be used by others. Last but not least, you obviously need users. Those will be the people and developers and so on using that framework. And I mean, you can measure the success of the framework by how many people are using it. So I just have a few examples of framework. You have, for instance, around analytical products, you can have a framework around how do you create that analytical product, what are the roles needed for it, what's the definition of it, and so on. But also how do you actually decommission one? What do you need to do? How do you need to handle dependencies and so on? Then there are more hands-on frameworks, such as code frameworks for ingestion, for data monitoring, data retention, and so on, with code reusable components and so on. And then when you come into data governance, how do you catalog your data? How do you catalog the usage of your data and have that traceability, lineage, and easy to use definitions? How do you measure your data quality? But also a framework around how do you work with data near protection, with pseudonymization, anonymization, identifying PII data, and so on. So my key points that I want to make around this is that you can scale successfully with frameworks. Use them to help, not control your teams. start small, start iterating and creating the frameworks as you go along, rather than trying to make a very big project out of it. But dream big. See, this is where we want to go with our framework. We want to have an end-to-end data management framework, for instance. And lastly, this is a collaboration effort. This can only be done when you collaborate together as a company. That was basically my, how do I put it, my heartfelt topic that I love to talk about, that I spend an inordinate amount of time on in general. I'm now open for questions.
Thanks a lot, Olof, for this thought-provoking presentation at the end of the day, and energetic. Thanks a lot. I just do one thing, because it's the last presentation. I would like to give everybody the option of camera and mic, but Lucia, get a pilot, and Shafik will be the first and second people who can ask the question, because they have written it there. So give me a second now.
I will stop my share so that we get the video up.
We can see them. Perfect. So Lucia, please start your mic and camera to see you. Very active today.
Yes. Hello. Thank you, Olof, for a very nice presentation. I just had a very small question out of curiosity. In practice, if you have this open source internal code, which I guess will really facilitate this standardization and everything. Sorry for my children, they're just out from school.
No problem.
How do you safeguard the code? Make sure that the changes that one team does not like break something else, which I imagine could be a risk.
So one part that you do is you create, how to put it, reviewers and approvers of the additions, and those are generally senior developers from a few of the different teams. And so when you want to push say that I have created an XML file reader, or rather I've extended the XML file reader, and I want to push that into the master branch, and then I send that for review. And then depending on how big your organization is, you can maybe say that 3 of them should approve the change for it to go in. And then you need to look at that. And you also need, when you change a component, you also need to have a process for how do you roll that out, how do you redeploy the existing flows that utilizes the new component. So you need to have that process in place as well.
Thanks a lot. I hope, Lucia, it was enough reply to your question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Olof.
We have at home a prisoner who is taking care of kids. Yeah, today is the last day of school here in Italy, so I don't know how you have it. So lucky we are here, Lucia. And now Shafik from Grundfos.
So
Shafik, I can't hear you. Can you make your microphone active?
So I can't hear you, but I can read your question in the chat, and that is basically, is this a framework that can be related with DataOps? And so I would say definitely. I mean, this approach doesn't really you don't need to choose whether, I mean, the different type of, I mean, how do I put it? Trends in what to do comes and goes. So, I mean, DataOps and those kind of frameworks on how you work with that can definitely be, I mean, using frameworks with that is definitely a good option. And I mean, if you work with data mesh, for instance, you will have different teams that are responsible for different domains, and these and these different domains can still use the same common components in order to speed up there. And the question, how is it related with MLOps and DataOps? So part of the framework for how we work with MLOps is basically setting that process. You set that tool stack on what is included in a general MLOps stack. So when you have, for instance, so what we have for our cloud environment, we have infrastructure as code environment, where we say, okay, here, when a data scientist comes along, we say, here is your environment, this is how you instantiate it. Then you get the whole ML environment with notebooks, with the whole ML ops stack, with those, with the cube flow processes and so on. So that infrastructure as code becomes part of the framework. And you can change that as a data scientist if you need to use some specific services that aren't included. Once you're happy with those additions you've made and say, well, everyone is going to use this computer vision API, for instance, then we can include that service back into that whole, that kind of ML template. And the next question is, how do we plan this integration to work in data mesh? So I think this works, in my opinion, this is something that works well with all of the data mesh concepts, because you will have different teams that are fully responsible for their solution end to end for their data domain products. But between the data domain products, there are a lot of standards that will be that should be the same on how do you access it, how do you work with it, but also a lot of functionality that will be the same, because in most cases, how you ingest files, how you read from Kafka, how you read those kind of streaming messages, for instance, the whole basic part, scaffolding and components of that are the same, could be the same between those data domain products. Whereas it's actually, what data do I bring in? How do I model it? What models do I build? How do I expose them? Those are things that are very data domain specific, but the technology and the code you build can definitely be shared between the teams.
Thanks a lot, Olof, for the explanation. Now, extra questions, guys. Everybody has the option of switching on camera and mic so that you can ask your questions. Tonya, if you have a question. Tobias from IKEA.
I have a question. Sorry, I'm not going to switch on my camera. I'm on my way somewhere, but I'm not sure if maybe you cover it. First of all, I really like the approach of the frameworks, and something also we want to do. But how much of this do you use kind of ready-made external frameworks, for example, Flow for modern versioning? And how much
I would say, yeah, as much as possible. So, and so that's always an option, right? When we look at, for instance, data pipeline, if we want to use data flow on GCP, then there's a framework called SIO that Spotify open sourced, for instance, that can be utilized. MLflow is another great example that could definitely be the big starting point. And I mean, as long as that framework covers, say that it covers, I mean, ideally it covers everything you want to do, and then you don't really need to extend it that much, just make it yours. In some cases, you can get a starting point from an external framework. So I would, yes, I would say that it's good to start looking externally for what are the frameworks out there, what do they look like, what's the quality, what can I use, but also be aware of that most frameworks out there aren't perfect. Most of them aren't going to be enterprise production ready, which means that you need to spend some effort in taking those and making them run properly in your enterprise. MLflow, for instance, getting the permissions running properly is something that is not super included in the framework.
Exactly, and maybe then you need to create like a meta framework that you build yourselves to make all this framework translated in your enterprise and speak together, which is.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
I refer to that as a framework of frameworks.
Perfect, thanks.
Thanks, Tonia, for the question. Now, just to complete the answer to the question of Shafik from Grundfos, can you say some good framework for data pipelines like MLflow for MLOps?
So I would say SIO, for instance, from Spotify, especially if you're on, and it depends a bit on what environment you're on, but if you're on GCP, then SIO. I would have to say that I'm not sure for Azure, though. That is not my area of expertise, so I don't have a good framework to just call out for that. SIO for GCP.
Thanks a lot.
Sorry,
Yes. So, okay, thanks for typing it. So other questions? 1, 2,